All right, the next most important philosopher in ancient Greece during the Hellenic period, after Socrates and Plato, is the great Aristotle. He stands as a giant at the beginnings of our philosophy. He's equally important as Plato. Well, with Plato, although he wrote dialogues, and we have most of the dialogues, like 37 dialogues, we only had a glimpse of a few of them, the early, middle, and late dialogues. And Plato also gave lectures at the first university called the Academy, but we don't have any of those lectures. With Aristotle, we have just the opposite. We have only his lecture material, but we don't have any of the dialogues. We know they actually existed because people like Cicero and ancient authors quoted from them and spoke, and all the ancient writers spoke of them, but we don't have any of his dialogues. We have only his lecture notes that he gave at his own university, which he called the Lyceum. So let me just give you some background information about Aristotle that's important, just to get to know him a little bit. And I will speak about his works and his achievements in general. And then I'm going to focus on two works. One is called Peripsyche in Greek. In Latin, it's called De Anima. Anima means soul in Latin. The reason sometimes they use the Latin is because Aristotle was so important during the Middle Ages and throughout history, and Latin was the language of the learned. And it's translated into English, On the Soul. So this is like the first psychology book, but it's also philosophy. At this point in history, philosophy and psychology had not separated yet. And then I'm going to concentrate on perhaps one of the most fully developed ethical systems in ancient philosophy, and that's called the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. So I'll do that in this lecture, and that will correspond to your readings on the soul and the Nicomachean Ethics. But there's so much more to Aristotle. I also want to sort of transmit the proper attitude towards some of these thinkers. The proper attitude is just one of absolute respect and reverence. When you get closer and closer to their thought and you see the breadth and the depth of their thinking, someone like Aristotle, it's just amazing. So what equally important to knowing their thought is to assume the proper attitude. We have to learn to revere what is reverable. And Aristotle's thought is absolutely reverable. I mean, one contribution was just one of many great contributions to human mind and education was the invention of logic, induction and deductive logic, and then informal logic, which dominated logic only until the dawning of the modern period. And then it was built on Aristotle. And that was just one of his contributions. But let me just give you some information about Aristotle, about his life and his works. And then I'm going to concentrate on the soul, the book on De Anima, on the soul, and the Nicomachean Ethics. So one thing that you probably should know about Aristotle's life is that he was a student of Plato for 20 years at Plato's Academy. And he was the star student. In fact, his nickname was Nous, which in Greek means mind. And he was Aristotle. And another thing, he wasn't born in Athens or in southern Greece. He was born up north near Thessaloniki. In fact, I was there. My friend lives there actually in Thessaloniki, but near Thessaloniki, Salonika they call it. And like in the Bible when Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, and it's an ancient Byzantine city. It's really impressive. But nearby, up north, there's a town by the sea. It's called Stygida. And I was lucky to go there with the archaeologists. And there was a conference there on Aristotle's political philosophy. He wrote one of the major treatises on political thought. It's Republican political theory. And it's called The Politics. It's 10 books long. It's one of the major contributions to political theory. After Plato's Republic, if you're interested in the history of Republican political theory, then there's Aristotle's Politics. And there was a conference on Aristotle's Politics, and we met in Stygida, at his hometown, and we had the conference there up in northern Greece. So he was born up there in Stygida, by the sea. And but he moved to Athens, hearing about Plato's academy, and he studied there with Plato for 20 years. When Plato passed away, Plato was about 40, there's about 40 years difference between Socrates and Plato, and then Plato and Aristotle. And when Plato died, Aristotle assumed that he would become the rector of the university, but Plato gave it to his stepson, Specipius. And Aristotle was taken back by that. And, it dawned on me in a dream one time. For some reason, it came to me in a dream. Why was it that Plato didn't give Aristotle the directorship of the academy? And Plato came to me in a dream, and he told me if I had done that, he would have been just another disciple, one of my disciples. He would have become another Platonist. But this gave Aristotle the feeling, that I'm going to do this my own way. So he parted company with Plato. He left Athens and started his own university called the Lyceum. But it wasn't just a new university. It was founded on entirely different metaphysical principles. But he was greatly influenced by Plato. So the more you study, some people think they have to choose between Plato and Aristotle. In some places you do have to choose. Those are called antinomies in philosophy, where if you accept one thing, then you have to reject the other. But the more mature way, I think, of approaching it was to take them both on. And then you take them on with how much ever effort and time you want to spend on it. However much you put into it, that's what you get out of it. And what you do is agree. There's certain places where you can see that Aristotle has accepted Plato's position, but he'll tweak it, he'll change it, and sometimes fundamentally change it. But at the same time, the general idea is the same. So you can take it on that way. But he studied with Plato for 20 years. After Plato's death, he went his own way. And then toward the end of, around the end of the Hellenic period, Alexander the Great, which was King Philip's son, there's a big, in Thessaloniki, there's a big museum dedicated to King Philip. His son was Alexander the Great. So all the shields of there, and I went there when I was up in Thessaloniki and saw that Alexander's shield and everything, and it's a big museum. But Alexander the Great was King Philip's son, and he wanted to unite all of Greece into a nation, one power. It wasn't a nation yet. The nation state hadn't been invented yet. That comes in the modern period. But Alexander then heard about Aristotle, and King Philip wanted Aristotle to be Alexander's teacher, his tutor. And so Aristotle took him on. So Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor for some time, when Alexander was a teenager and young man. Well, later on, the empire that Alexander tried to establish, it collapsed, and it created havoc in Greece. And there was a lot of anti-Alexandrian sentiments in Greece. And they associated Aristotle with Alexander the Great. And they trumped up these charges against him, like they did with Socrates. And one of the alternatives was to take exile. And so Aristotle was famous to have said, that he'll choose exile, unlike Socrates, because he won't allow Athens to commit a second crime against philosophy. Well, the first crime was the execution of Socrates. And so he went his own way. And it's good that he did, because he started his own school of thought, and that's called realism. And there are great realists that come after Aristotle. They're different from Aristotle, but the metaphysical assumptions are basically the same, but they're quite different too. So he started this whole school of thought called realism. And he's just a giant. He just dominates Western philosophy. And they didn't even have to say his name in the Middle Ages. It was just, when they wanted to quote Aristotle, they would say, as the philosophers said. Everybody knew they were talking about Aristotle. And it's just colossal mind. and all we have are these notes. We don't even have the dialogues, but the notes are enough to show. They're like, I don't know how many volumes there are. The complete set of Aristotle's works come in, like, I don't know exactly how many, but it's huge. Now, Aristotle was, what's important is that unlike Plato, Aristotle decided that he's going to demarcate particular disciplines. The disciplines didn't even exist before Aristotle. So what he did is he said, this is going to be ethics, this is metaphysics, this is physics, this is psychology, this is political philosophy, this is logic, and these are the different parts of logic. He had this complex system, and he showed how they all fit together too. But he made these different regions. So before, in Plato, if you look at one dialogue, there's many different disciplines all at work there. There's philosophy of art, there's political, like the Republic, for example, there's philosophy of education, there's epistemology, there's ethics, there's political philosophy, there's logic, it's all there. Each dialogue contains them all. What Aristotle decided to do is to make disciplines. So he's made disciplines. So there's logic and there's different parts of logic and so on. So that's important to know that. And he wrote on induction and deduction, the prior analytics, that's the whole deductive theory, the syllogism and so on. It dominates Western, the whole theory of deductive logic, which is so important. Inductive logic, science rests on inductive logic. Then he wrote the sophistical refutations, where all the informal fallacies are. He wrote a major treatise on rhetoric. We have that. It's not really treatises, these are lecture notes, but they've made them into like books and treatises. Major book in politics, it's called simply called the Politics. It's a key book. I told you there was a conference, conference in Greece where people came all over the world just to give lectures on Aristotle's Politics. He wrote 3 books on ethics. The most fully developed is the Nicomachean Ethics. Why is it called Nicomachean? His father, his name was Nicomachus. His son, his name was Nicomachus. By the way, Aristotle was married and had children. So unlike, well, Socrates did too, but not Plato. And so it's sort of a rhetorical trope used, like advice from a father to his son, only it's to all posterity, to us. He wrote 10 books on metaphysics. He wrote a book on physics. He wrote the first book on the parts of animals, first anatomy book. At the Lyceum, it was more like a working laboratory. There was a library there. There was a lot of work done in biology and anatomy and botany, and I'm leaving something important out. Well, those are just some of his works, not all of them. So it's colossal, and he made all these different disciplines and then showed how these different disciplines. But let's focus on 2. One is called De Anima, or On the Soul in English. Peri psyche. Peri means about in Greek, and psyche is where we get the word psyche. The word psyche in Greek means soul. And that's where we get psychology, so on. And then the Politics. Now, Aristotle claims that the 2 sciences that study the highest good for humans, which came to be called the summum bonum in Latin, the highest good, are politics and ethics. These 2 sciences belong together because they're practical sciences, and they study what are the conditions that bring about the highest good for humans. Now, the highest good is thought differently in terms of politics than it is in ethics. In politics, it's the highest good for the people, the community. We can call it the state. In ethics, it has to do with the highest good for the individual, and the individual in relationship to immediate family, the extended family, and the immediate community, but not the larger community. So, now, Aristotle emphasizes the social nature of humans. So we're by nature social beings. A lot of philosophers think we become social um, by means of a social contract. So it's becoming social as a kind of artificial thing, like for John Locke and so on. But for Aristotle, humans are naturally social beings. So he's going to always show our relationship to others. So then the politics and the ethics belong together. They're two practical sciences that study the highest good for humans. In fact, ethics is nothing other than a branch of politics. So we have to study them together. But he made two different books, the Nicomachean Ethics. Then he had two other ethics books too that he wrote before that, but the Nicomachean is the most fully developed. And then the politics. The other book that the Nicomachean Ethics is closely associated with, I had a seminar on that book at Penn State from famous Aristotle scholar. I'm sure he's passed away by now. Johnstone, now I remember his name, Henry Johnstone. He was quite a character, and we had a seminar at his home at Penn State on the soul, on the book De Anima. But that book is connected to the ethics. So I want to talk about the connection between Aristotle's reflections on the soul of humans and his reflections on how to live in order to achieve the highest good. So this is the big practical question. And you can see that's Plato's main question too, but they're going to approach it, Aristotle's going to approach it from a completely different angle. So what are the conditions that bring about the highest good or the well-being of the individual? That's the goal of ethics. Okay. And the goal of politics is, what are the conditions of the state? What is the structure of the state such that it would bring about the well-being of the commonwealth, of the people? That's the goal of politics. Sometimes we lose sight of that in our political arenas. But that's the whole purpose of politics, to bring about the well-being of people. Okay, so the Nicomachean Ethics has 10 books. And book 1 is all about the highest good for humans. And the book, you have to get back into the nitty-gritty of, they found these papyrus scrolls, and their notes that Aristotle gave at the Lyceum. So the editors have to put them together, and usually they make a table of contents with very specific titles to each section, so that helps. But they made it into 10 books, and the first book is all about the highest good for humans. And then it moves into the book 2, is all about moral goodness, because he wants to establish what is the highest good for humans. Well, I'll tell you now. It's called eudaimonia, E-U-D-A-I-M-O-N-I-A, eudaimonia. And eu in Greek means good, like euphoria, and daimonia comes from daimon, which means attendant spirit. So literally the book means the highest good for humans, or what Aristotle calls the final purpose of human life. There's certain locutions where you have to just be very rigorous and just use the exact same words as the author. Like this, for example, the final purpose of human life. Notice, we have to be precise, because it's not the meaning of life. For Aristotle, there's no meaning to life, but there's a final purpose to life. And achieving that perhaps gives someone meaning, but he's not looking for the meaning of life. He's looking for the final purpose of life, and he's asking, what is that, and what are the conditions that will bring that about? So eudaimonia, it means literally having a good attendant spirit. Daimon means attendant spirit. But I don't make much of the etymology of that word, because I think the word originated in earlier times. Maybe we talked about the age of the gods and the age of heroes. in different nations. And people were much more superstitious in ancient times than they've become in modern times. So I think people might have thought that if you had a good life, that you had a good attendant spirit, like a guardian angel. Of course, that idea comes with Christianity later on, but similar idea. But for Aristotle, it's not having a good, it's not literally having a good attendant. If you have a good life, then you made a good life. Aristotle is very much internal locus of control. Humans are responsible for everything. I mean, he knows that there are accidents and there's fate and there's good luck and bad luck. He knows about that and he thinks about that and shows to what extent luck and fate, play a part in people's life. But he really emphasizes taking charge of your life and gaining control of your life. In fact, we're responsible for our own happiness. We're responsible. If you're not happy, it's sort of your fault. Although he makes, I mean, sometimes people just have bad luck and there's bad fate. So he's very much emphasizing all the responsibility is on us. So the book 2 is all about moral goodness. And Aristotle is going to argue in this book that the final purpose of human life is eudaimonia, is well-being. Sometimes they translate it as happiness. I think your book translates it as happiness, which is fine. It's as long. What I do, I think I've shared this with you. When it comes to key words, I just leave them in the original language, and I use the transliteration. You know what a transliteration is like? eudaimonia. And that's eudaimonia. But those are not using ancient Greek letters. If I use ancient Greek letters, then that's the original ancient Greek. So scholars have come up with what they call transliteration, and they're using Roman letters, Latin letters, like the letters of English and German and French, Spanish, and so on. Those come from Latin, those letters, and they use those letters to make the same sounds. So eudaimonia is eudaimonia, but it doesn't. Those aren't the letters if you were to use the actual Greek. That would be the original. So eudaimonia is the transliteration, and usually they translate that as happiness, or sometimes you'll see well-being. But like I told you, what I do is I just use it. I leave it in the ancient language, not just any keywords. I just leave it like that, and that way there's no connotations that stick to those words from later times. That way I can get back to the original meaning of the words better. So I just use it, but it's well-being or happiness. But it's not happiness the way we think of it today. It's not like being in a good mood all the time. It's more like a sense of fulfillment, like there's nothing lacking in your life. So this is the final purpose of human life, to achieve happiness or well-being, or just leave it eudaimonia, the final purpose of human life. And he talks all about that in book 1. Book 2, he shows how moral goodness is related to eudaimonia. In fact, there's no way of achieving eudaimonia without moral excellence. Now, the Greek word for moral excellence is arete, A-R-E-T-E. And Aristotle, what he means by that is excellence of character, okay? So excellence of the spirit is courage. Excellence of the mind is wisdom. Excellence of the appetites is temperance. So whenever anything serves its proper function well, it achieves arete. It can be anything, like a knife. If a knife is sharp and it cuts well, then that knife possesses arete. If a herding dog is naturally good at herding, that dog possesses arete. Whenever anything is serving, when a racing thoroughbred runs swiftly and good, then that horse possesses arete. Now, what about a human being? Well, for Aristotle, there are artai, the plural, that are related to different parts of the human soul. That's why knowledge of the human soul is very important for knowledge of ethics. And book 2 is all about moral virtue, arte. And he just lays it out in a outline form in book 2. Then in book 3 and 4 and 5, he goes through each of the moral virtues one by one and shows the vices that are associated with the extreme and deficiency. We'll have to talk about his theory of moral virtue now. And then he goes through each one by one. And then in book 6, in book 5, he devotes all to justice because it's so important. And justice is one of those things that pertain both to politics and to ethics. And think about it, the very word. Sometimes we say, the person is just or unjust, or sometimes we say the political structure is just or like fascism is an unjust political system, whereas republic is a more just system. Most people would assume that. Book 7 is on the intellectual virtues. Aristotle is going to distinguish between the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. Now, Plato never did that. As I move through this, I'll tell you the differences, the key differences between Plato and Aristotle. Book 7 is all about continence and incontinence. Those words are taken from medicine. Like if somebody's incontinent, they can't control their bodily functions. But what Aristotle's talking about is moral continence, because he knows that a human being is not just intellect, but we also have a will. My friend said his father used to teach him, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So that shows that if somebody's convinced against their will, they're still going to do what they want to do, even though intellectually they understand something, but their will is not strong enough. So he makes a distinction between the will and the intellect. And so he has to talk about moral continence and incontinence. That is, sometimes people know what's right and they don't do what's right because they give in to bribes and they become corrupt, and that's the basis of corruption. They give in to fear, losing their job, or fear of this or that, or their career may, this is happening in politics today. People are going along with things because they're afraid that they'll lose their jobs or whatever. They won't make as much money or whatever. So they know what's right. Some people know what's right, but they don't do what's right because they don't have the willpower. So he calls that moral incontinence. And then also in book 7, he talks about pleasure and why pleasure is not the highest good for humans. Now, he's not going to rule out pleasure. Of course, he knows that without pleasure, it's not a good life. But pleasure is not the highest good, so he's not a hedonist. Like Epicurus, we're going to study, who is a hedonist. And then we're not going to go through all this. I just wanted to give you an overview of the book. Book 8 and 9 are all about friendship. So remember I told you in Plato, there's a really rich and deep concept of friendship. It still lingers around when people say, I'm having a platonic relationship. And basically what they mean is we're just not having sex. But there's a lot more to Plato's notion of, have you ever thought about that? Why do they invoke the name Plato when, people, sometimes we speak and we don't know, really the history behind words. But that one is pretty strange. Like I'm having a platonic, why don't they say I'm having a Leonardo da Vinci relationship or, an Einsteinian relationship? They evoke the name of Plato. Why? Well, it's because of Plato's rich and deep notion of friendship. And it's a sublimation of the erotic drives. And so it's not really based on sex, but it's a deeper kind of notion of the spiritualization of the sensuous, where people come together to make, and the result is they help each other to become better persons. It's part of it. But it's and Aristotle, he heard Plato lecturing. He studied with Plato for 20 years, so he knew about that. But he has his own notion of friendship. And people have written dissertations on, it's the most extended discussion of friendship next to Plato in ancient Greek. Well, Epicurus, it was a big deal for, actually all the Greek after the pre-Socratics, all the Greek philosophers really emphasized friendship. By the way, there's something really important. It just reminds me then we'll get back to this. I forgot to tell you, this is an important point. When you move from the pre-Socratic to Socrates and Plato, the emphasis is on the human. I forgot to tell you that. That's really important. See, the pre-Socratics were concerned about nature and the origin of nature. And the human was part of nature. They didn't forget about humans. We're all part of nature. And then the question about how to live, well, live in harmony with reality, with nature, and that's a big part of Plato's philosophy too, and Aristotle. But the shift is, the accent is on the human in Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and later Greek philosophy. Although they have extended discussions about nature, non-human nature, the whole thing is about humans. The key ideas, the accent is on the human. So there's two big books 8 and 9 are all about friendship. And they're really worth reading. I mean, they're just full of golden ideas. Like here's one just about friendship that, like he says, well, there are relationships that seem like friendship, but it's really not friendship. Like when two people help each other, one hand washes the other. It's all based on utility, but that's not true friendship for Aristotle. Like a business relationship, I help you, you help me. It's okay that friends help each other. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the basis of friendship, then as soon as you don't need that person or the person doesn't need you, then you don't see them anymore. And then some friendships are based on pleasure, he says. But as soon as times get hard, you don't see that person anymore because the very basis of that friendship was pleasure. And then there's another kind of true friendship is based on mutual respect for one another's character. See, that's more rare because good characters are rare. And that one's lasting, he says. You respect the person for who they are, not for what they can do for you. So it's just full of, insights like that. So those are, I remember when I was in Greece, one of the students was writing his dissertation on Aristotle's idea of friendship. The last book is, he goes back to the notion of pleasure there in book 10. But the main thing about the last book, book 10, is about why is it that the contemplative life is the best kind of life. In book 1, he says the contemplative life is the best kind of life, but he doesn't give any arguments why that's the case. And so I think he postpones that because he doesn't want to, he waits till the end. This was probably a lecture course that he gave. And he waited till the end to give arguments why the contemplative life, because he didn't want to give the impression that he's teaching monkish solitude. He doesn't want people to withdraw from the world. In fact, in order to achieve eudaimonia, one has to be an active citizen in the polis. So he's emphasizing our engagement in political and activities. There's going to be an accent on activity for Aristotle. So he gives arguments why the contemplative life is the best kind of life, but that doesn't rule out the man or woman of action. I think the ideal person for Aristotle would be somebody who's an activist and at the same time a contemplative. Maybe someone like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. had a PhD in theology. That's about as contemplative as it gets. And yet he's an activist, right? And Gandhi too was a great saint and contemplative. He was studying Sanskrit. He's like one of the saints of India. And yet he got the British out of India. And that's big, right? He's a great activist. So there are people who do both. You don't have to choose being either a man or a woman of action or contemplative. His ideal is both. So let me just, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed because the course is moving so fast and these texts are so rich and we're trying to cover so much material. And normally I spend quite a long time on Aristotle. I mean, usually if I teach a course of 15 weeks, I have like 3 or 4 books, and I break it. And so I'll spend maybe 4 weeks, on Aristotle's ethics. And still, you're and you can do a pretty good job with that. But to give one big lecture on Aristotle, but this is a survey course. So let me just make some comments, and I'll try to integrate uh, his reflections on the soul and why that's important with regard to ethics. So the most philosophical part of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics is the last section, and that's section 13. So each chapter, each book, they call them books, they're really chapters. It's one big book, the Nicomachean Ethics, and it has 10 chapters, but in classical, sometimes they call those chapters books. Each book or each chapter has sections. The last section, it's about the relationship between the human soul and moral excellence. And I like to concentrate on that. So there was a book that he wrote before this, or a lecture course that he gave that was made into a book. It's called On the Soul. And you have some excerpts from that in your anthology. So the first part of that book, I won't go through the whole book. I told you I had a seminar on that. And actually, my paper was published. I wrote a paper for that on Plato and Aristotle on the soul, and I handed it in as my final project. And in grad school, usually you just write one big paper at the end of the course, and they actually got published and translated into many languages. So I was proud of that. But it was on Plato and Aristotle on the soul. So I remember the course and the book pretty well. It's like the first psychology book, only it's connected with philosophy. So what Aristotle does in the first part of that book on the soul is he takes up the pre-Socratic notion of the soul, and he goes through, and he claims that they all made the mistake of making the soul into some kind of substance, like air or whatever. And he claims it's not a substance. Actually, it's not absolutely correct, because we studied some of the, Anaximander never made it into a substance, but he claims all the pre-Socratics made it into one of the 4 substances, and it's not that. So, so what is the soul? Well, he ends up giving a definition of the soul, and he coins a new word, entelechy, E-N-T-E-L-I-C-H-Y. Entelechy means, en means to put something into action, like to enact something, and telechy is rooted in the word telos in Greek, which means purpose or end or the goal of something. Now, Aristotle is a teleological thinker. He really emphasizes in all of his works, in the ethics and everything. Everything has a purpose for Aristotle. Like the purpose of an orange tree is to produce oranges. A rose bush is to produce oranges. And humans have purposes too. So everything has this purpose. And the purpose of human life is to achieve eudaimonia, happiness. The purpose of the state is to create the conditions for the eudaimonia of the citizenry. So, and telechy is rooted in the word telos, which means purpose. So entelechy means the enacting of the purposes of things. So he defines the human soul as the first entelechy of a natural body with the potentiality for life. That's his definition of the soul. And what he means by that is Aristotle was the first to really make a big distinction between potential and actual. Like an acorn has all the potentiality to become an oak tree, and it's all in that seed. So what is it that allows that potentiality to become actual? And that's the soul. If the soul enters into the acorn, then it becomes an oak. Well, there's more than that. Conditions have to be there, right? It has to fall in some soil, it has to have some space, it has to have some light and water and so on. The conditions are right, then life starts in that acorn, and it starts sending its roots, it germinates, and one day, if the conditions are right, it becomes a great oak tree. So a natural body has organs, like humans are born with organs. But if the soul is not there, none of those organs can do what they can do. That's why, like, when somebody dies, the soul leaves the body. So for a while, before it rots away, there's still eyes there, there's still nose, mouth, ears, hands, everything, but it can't do anything. It doesn't do anything because there's no soul there. So what is the soul? The soul is the power that brings potentiality into actuality. It's the first entelechy. It enacts the telai, the purposes, and allows them to do what they can do. The first entelechy of a natural body with the potentiality for life. I didn't know what the word first meant for a while, and then it took some research. I found out what he means by first. First means that even though you're not using your eyes, like when you're sleeping, they still can do what they can do, but they're just not doing it. You may have ears, but you don't hear anything, but still the ears can do what they can do. They're just not listening. That's what he means by first, but that doesn't matter. All right, so whenever I used to teach, since I don't have a blackboard, I made this little thing. It's not that big of a deal. De anima, okay, that's a picture of the soul. So that little, if you look into that, you see there's a circle inside the circles, right? There's a little circle. The smallest circle has a V in it. What that represents is the vegetative soul. That's the plant soul. And then around that, there's a circle. So the vegetative soul is inside of another circle. That other circle is called the sensitive soul. That's the animal soul. And then around that, there's another circle. I think it's good to visualize it this way because it shows the vegetative soul is inside the sensitive soul. But both the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul are inside the rational soul. See that R right there? It represents reason. So the V represents vegetative, the S represents sensitive, the R represents reason. And then reason, I made a dotted line around that because reason, he distinguishes two kinds of reason. There's deliberative reason and contemplative reason. Now, Plato never made that distinction. It's an important one. So that's a little diagram of the human soul. Now, why is that so important? Well, Aristotle is going to argue that, well, before we go into that, let me just talk more about that and so you understand it a little bit better. So what Aristotle means, let's just keep to the de anima for a while until you understand that. And then you'll see in section 13 of book 1, he takes that knowledge that he developed in de anima and he uses it to base parts of his ethics. The whole of his ethics, really, the main parts of the ethics. So, but let's just talk about on the soul first. So what is that little so book 2 of on the soul, it's all about plant souls. He talks about the souls of plants. So plants have a soul. Because anything living has a soul, and the soul is what gives life. So anything living has a soul. Later on, the only thing that have souls are humans, and the notion of soul gets more and more narrowly defined. But in ancient philosophy, in fact, in Plato, everything has a soul, even inorganic, the whole world has a soul. He calls it the world soul. The universe is a living being. It has a soul. But Aristotle, he starts with plants, vegetative kingdom. So in it, there's inanimate. That's why it's called inanimate. It's not, there's in means without, and anima is soul. So the inanimate world is without a soul, like rocks and things like that. But as soon as you start with plants, like algae, the most simple forms of plant life, then it has a soul. Whatever's living has a soul. So he talks at length about the plant soul, and he talks about the function. Actually, there's a whole notion of photosynthesis there. He doesn't use the word, but he talks about how plants can take in nourishment, turn it into their own energy, and how they can propagate their own species, and he goes into depth about the plant soul. Now, so he calls that the vegetative soul. So that's book 2 of the De Anima. Then he goes into this, what he calls the sensitive soul. So that's basically the animal soul. The next kingdom up is animal. And the animal soul contains within itself the vegetative soul. That's why sometimes when an animal becomes brain dead, it's still living. You know, humans too, when they're hooked up to artificial processes, they can become, everything's still working, but there's no consciousness, nothing. So the vegetative part is still working, it's still living, but there's no thought, there's no consciousness, there's no sight, there's no hearing, nothing. But it's living. So that means we have a vegetative part to it. Well, the hair keeps growing, you know, our nails grow, and, you know, there are processes that just take place. The cells of our skin and so on shed, and this process just takes place, and these are all vegetative processes. So the vegetative soul is contained within the animal soul. Now, the essence of the animal for Aristotle is appetites. Anybody who's lived with animals, or you know how important feeding time is, and there's all these drives. In each of the species have different kinds of drives, and it's the beauty of the animal kingdom. And most of them are like innate and instinctive. And that's the beauty of the animal. So the essence of animality for Aristotle is appetites. Okay. And animals have a mind too, he talks about, but they don't have intellect. They don't have reason, he thinks. Beginnings of it may be in the higher mammals, but not like humans. So they have a mind, they have memory, they have locomotion, you know, and he shows the differences between the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. So he calls that the sensitive soul, because animals have 5 senses and we have faces. Now humans are, Aristotle taught us, when you want to define something, this idea was already in Plato, but he thematized it. There are a lot of things in Plato that he thematized. Do you know that word thematize? Thematize means you raise something to consciousness. It's there, but it's pre-reflective. You're not thinking about it. Like there's logic already in Plato, but he never made logical structures, and he never invented logic. They just used it. So sometimes, like the floor beneath your feet, you know the floor is there beneath your feet, but you didn't think about it. You're conscious of that, but that's called pre-reflexive consciousness. But then when you raise it to consciousness, that's called you thematize it. You make it an object of your consciousness. So Aristotle raises this up, makes it an object of his consciousness. He thematized. So thematize what? The notion of genus and species. Whenever you want to define something, you find out to what class it belongs to. That's its genus. Okay, not genius, genus, Genus. That's the class. And then the next question is, this thing I'm trying to define, I know the class, but how is it different from everything else in that class? That's called the differentia, the specific difference. If you have the specific difference in the species, in the genus of something, then you can define it. So what's the definition of a human then? Well, we're animals. That's very big. I know that sounds strange, but in modern philosophy, it starts in medieval thought. And the Renaissance is a little bit different. But in modern philosophy, and the major current of thought in medieval and even Renaissance thought is that humans are not animals. Okay? But the ancients, the pre-Socratics knew it wasn't even an issue for them. We're definitely animals. Nowadays, if you watch movies or series, the worst thing anyone can call anyone is an animal. Yeah, you ever think about that? as though being an animal is like the worst thing in the world. Ever since I was a little boy, I always felt um, gratitude that I was an animal. I mean, I felt privileged, to be an animal because I loved animals all my life. But now it's the most pejorative thing you can say. Why? Why is that such a horrible thing? I'm not an animal. Because in philosophy and in theology, humans are not animals because the soul is not part of our animal soul. But Aristotle uh, thought that's our genus, and the ancients have no problem with that. So, but the next question is, how is this animal, this human animal, different from all the other non-human animals? Well, his answer is we have reason. So humans are the animale razionale. We're the rational animal. We have intellect. Animals have minds, of course they do. And some are pretty smart, actually, but they don't have reason. They don't think about first principles. Like my dogs are not thinking about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics right now. They're thinking about when we can go play again. So that's this reason all around the sensitive soul. So humans are rational animals. But now, unlike Plato, who never distinguished those two kinds of reason, there's contemplative reason and there's deliberative reason. So deliberative reason gives commands to the sensitive soul. And the sensitive soul, the animal part of us, either obeys or disobeys those commands. There's deliberative reason where we deliberate. And then now here's one way in which the knowledge of the human soul gives a foundation for ethics. If we act habitually with deliberative reason commanding, and the sensitive part of the soul obeys, and at first it's a struggle, and then later on it naturally obeys, then automatically all the moral virtues accrue in one's character. This is a big difference between Plato and Aristotle. Try to remember this. For Plato, if you read the dialogues of Plato, especially the early dialogues, remember I told you all the early dialogues form a chain of dialogues, each one reflecting on a particular moral virtue. The assumption is that if you could know what courage is, for example, then you would become courageous. Otherwise, you'd be deliberately harming yourself. Or if you could know what temperance is, then you would become temperate. So that's why Socrates was always looking for the idea of these moral virtues. He looked for other ideas as well. But what is courage? He asked the general in one dialogue called The Lashes. What is piety? You read the Euthyphro. And the reason he wants to know what it is, he wants the essence of it, is that if you could know what it is, Plato thought you'd be transformed. If you know what courage is, you're going to become courageous. But you might not know what it is. Well, Aristotle, being the realist and not the idealist, he claims it's good to know what is courage and what is these moral virtues. Aristotle will talk about 12 moral virtues. But how does one become courageous or temperate or generous or any of the moral virtues? By acting habitually in that way. Every good parent knows that. Every good animal trainer knows this. And then it becomes a fine art. But what we're doing is training our own animal nature. So we're like all animal trainers, but we are the animal and we're the trainer both. So when the animal soul is obeying and the trainer is deliberative reason, he or she is commanding, at first there might be a struggle, and then later on it's just automatic, like a well-trained animal. Then all the moral virtues accrue. So when you act habitually with the proper measure in your feelings and actions, what's happening in the soul? The deliberative part of reason is commanding. The appetitive part is obeying. And characteristics develop from corresponding activities. So it's all based on habit. There's a Greek word, hexis, Hexis, means habit. And so it's like the beginnings of behaviorism a little bit. If you act in a particular way, good parents know this. They watch their children. If their child is being selfish, they intervene a little bit and they try to encourage generosity. And then one day will come when that person, their child, is automatically generous. Aristotle would distinguish activities that create moral virtues, and then there are activities that flow naturally from a virtuous character. It has to be the latter before it's actually virtue. Like if you're being generous because of some kind of coercion, then that's not generosity, for example. So let's get back to the soul again. And so all the moral virtues are rooted in these dynamics of the soul. Deliberative reason is commanding, the appetitive part is obeying. And then two of the intellectual virtues, remember I told you there's a distinction, he makes a distinction between the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. There are 5 intellectual virtues that he talks about. 2 of them, one is called techne, like Techne, the beginnings of our word technology. It means, in ancient Greek, it means knowledge of how to make things. It means both art and craft. They had only one word for art and craft. They didn't make a distinction between art and craft. I make a distinction. I like the distinct. Craft is, you know, how it's going to be when you're done. With an art, fine art, I'm talking about using the word art in the proper sense of the word. Because the word art, we can use it in all kinds of ways. But art, properly so called, is when you don't know how it's going to turn out. You allow it to unfold. Like the abstract expressionists, they were the ones that, or in jazz music, you allow things to sort of unfold and then you sort of follow it and create it at the same time. So you don't really know how it's going to be. With craft, you know exactly how it should be when you're finished. But art and craft, that's called techne. And then there's another one, another intellectual virtue called phronesis. This is really key. And it's very important. But all the intellectual virtues are important, but this is equally important. But one of my favorites is phronesis. And I've written on it and thought about it and given it a lot of thought. It means practical wisdom, phronesis, Phronesis. That's rooted in deliberative reason, okay? And so is techne, because think about it. When you're making something, whether it be art or craft, you're deliberating. How are you going to do this? Right? You're not contemplating, you're deliberating. And the same thing with leadership quality, which is phronesis. You're deliberating about a proper course of action. And for Aristotle, the proper course of action is the one that brings about well-being for whatever community you're working with. So that's called phronesis, and that's rooted in deliberative reason. So knowledge of the soul then, section 13, the last section of book 1, gives a philosophical basis for ethics because it shows all the moral virtues are rooted in the relationship between deliberative reason and the appetitive part of our soul. And 2 of the 5 intellectual virtues, namely phronesis and techne, they're rooted in the deliberative part of the soul. Okay. Now, there's 3 other intellectual virtues that I'll talk about. As I'm speaking, I'm realizing I'm going to have to break this down into at least 2 lectures on Aristotle. Otherwise it's just going to be me. Because I want to make sure, I don't want to just throw things out like smorgasbord, and then just eat a little bit of everything, and it turns into one big, like those buffets we go to. So I don't go to, but some people do. Not anymore, not during the pandemic. Don't go to a buffet. But the things I do talk about, I want you to understand. So it's going to take a little. I'll make 2 lectures on Aristotle's, on the soul and de anima. So we'll break this one off in a little bit here. So there's going to be 5 intellectual virtues, and those are going to be rooted in the contemplative part of the soul. Now, this is an important point. Let's not lose the big picture. The big picture is, what are the conditions that bring about the well-being of a human being? That's the very goal of ethics. And he's going to argue that activity in conformity with virtue is the very definition of happiness. Eudaimonia is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue, arte. So when we cultivate the moral virtues and when we cultivate the intellectual virtues, automatically this brings about our eudaimonia. So the road to happiness is moral virtue and intellectual excellence. So this is very different from the way people are trying to achieve happiness today. Hardly anyone associates becoming a good person with being happy. But for Aristotle, the road to well-being is the culmination. So let's put the pieces together. What is eudaimonia? It's an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. But there are 2 kinds of virtues, the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. So there's associated with the moral virtues and with the intellectual virtues, there's an accompanying sense of well-being. So the fulfillment or well-being comes by cultivating the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. There are 12 moral virtues, 5 intellectual virtues. There's probably more or less, but there's more. But he focuses on these 12 moral virtues and these 5 intellectual virtues. So 3 of the 5 we'll talk about next time. That's from book 6 of the Ethics. The first one is called episteme, which means knowledge. The second one is noesis, which means insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. And then Sophia, that's the third one. That's the combination of episteme and noesis. We'll talk about those 3 next time. Those are all rooted in the contemplative part of the soul. And accompanying that comes this sense of well-being or eudaimonia. And then there's 2 other intellectual virtues. Techne, knowledge of how to make things. Everyone knows how good that feels when you make something and you're proud of what you made. And then, or you feel good about a job well done. And then there's phronesis, choosing the best course of action. This is leadership quality. Whether you're leading someone or a community or any leadership position, or even you're leading yourself through life, it's based on phronesis, excellence and deliberation. So these are excellences that pertain uniquely to the human being. Remember, a human being is a rational animal. So those 5 intellectual virtues are excellences of our reason. And those 12 moral virtues are excellences of our spirit, of our animal nature, in conjunction with deliberative reason. So deliberative reason, so the techne and phronesis are excellences in deliberative reason. Episteme, which is knowledge in Greek, episteme means knowledge in Greek, noesis, and which is insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. That's noesis. And then the combination of that, Sophia, those are excellences of the intellectual part of our reason. So this is the happiness that pertains to humans. See, one of the things that I find in Aristotle is that organisms become happy when they're doing what they were born to do. Like turtles are happy when they're doing turtle things. And herding dogs are happy when they're herding. And everything is happy when it's doing what it was born to do. So what were humans born to do? Well, we were born, Aristotle thinks, what's uniquely human is reason. So if we can cultivate the rational part of our nature, then we cultivate our humanity. And as we cultivate our humanity, we experience this sense of fulfillment. We become truly human, true humans. Becoming human is a task. Of course, we're sort of born human. I mean, most of us are not born with tails and things like that, but in a philosophical sense, becoming human is a task. So as we cultivate our moral excellences and our intellectual excellences, or the excellences of contemplative reason and the excellences of deliberative reason, in conjunction with the animal soul, then we become more human. As we become more human, accompanying that is a sense of well-being. So this is some of the highlights of the Nicomachean Ethics. I think we need to talk one more time about the ethics, maybe not as long as I talk now. I want to go through the intellectual virtues a little bit more, and I want to give you the theory of the moral virtues a little bit more. But if you listen to this lecture, and I'll make one more on Aristotle, on the soul, and mostly on the Nicomachean Ethics. And if you do those readings, what I found is the editors of the anthology that I had you buy, they took pieces of all 10 books. So that's a good thing, actually. And they made some pretty good choices, but what I'll do is I'll concentrate on the big picture. I'll give you the big picture, and then you can use that to illuminate that. And you should, if you listen to these 2 lectures and do those readings and thoughtfully read, you should have a good sense of Aristotle's ethics and how the anima is related to ethics, how knowledge of the human soul is related to ethics. It's one of my favorite books. When I first read it, I was just making a transition in my major. Well, I majored in psychology as an undergrad. But then I made a transition into philosophy. So my mind was still thinking like a psychologist. The first thing that dawned on me was, if somebody wanted to be a healthy, mentally healthy person, you just follow Aristotle's ethics, because it's all about balance. It's about balancing our feelings, and we haven't talked about that yet, but it's about balancing our feelings and actions, not going to extreme in feelings or actions, and finding that metron, that proper measure. So we need to talk about that. That's the basis of his whole ethics. But what I was talking about today was mostly how the Nicomachean Ethics is rooted in his other book. The reason I did that is because that's the other reading that they chose for you on De Anima. But it's important. He took the part that you're going to read that Aristotle wrote on, called De Anima, on the soul, which you have excerpts. He took that and related it. Aristotle took that and related it to ethics in section 13 of book 1. So, and he uses it as a basis for his ethics. So that's what makes it more than just advice about how to live. It makes it a philosophy book on ethics. It has some grounding in reflections on the human soul. Okay, so that's an overview of the Nicomachean Ethics. We need to concentrate now on the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues and relate those to how that brings about well-being and how that's all related to politics too. Okay, so I'll make one more on Aristotle. All right, thank you. I'm still grading. I need the rest of your papers for midterm grades. All right, bye.